Are you showing grandbaby pictures? I figure. Typically, that's what we've been doing. We have a few minutes. Oh, I can hear over it. That one's fine. That one. Oh, it is. Well, good morning. How are you guys this morning? Are you ready for the cold breeze to come through? You have to be inside in an air conditioner to get the cold breeze, hopefully, as long as our air conditioners don't go out. It's unbelievable, the temperatures that we're looking at for this week, so kind of crazy out there. Well, I'm glad that you're here. If you have been here on Sunday mornings doing the Parenthood, then you will know that we keep pressing our way through the material. If this is your first week, it might scare you just a little bit. So we'll just continue that process. As we're talking about parenthood, we're talking about the goal of parenthood is to go after the heart. That's got to be the goal of parenting is that we're really ultimately going after the heart as we're seeking to raise children. And I just honestly, that's a difficult process because it seems a little bit elusive as we think about how do we go after their heart. Last week we talked about obedience, that we're moving towards obedience. Not only do we go after the heart, but as we go after the heart, we deal with behavior that is a reflection of the heart. And so we use the definition of obedience is the willing submission to one person to the authority of another, and it's manifested in two ways. One would be that the child does what I tell him to do, meaning that if I tell him to take out the trash or stop playing or come here or don't run out in the street. And then the other would be that my child refrains from doing what I tell him not to do. So don't touch the stove, don't do whatever it is that I've said that. And that is the heart of where we're moving towards, is building that obedience in that process. And I like the clarification they gave last week, is that it's not just doing what they're told, but it's doing it without challenge or excuse, without delay, without grumbling and complaining, or without an attitude. And so just looking at those three is that as we're seeking to raise children that are obedient, that obedience has come from the heart. It's not just enough for them to obey, but it also is in the way that they obey in that process. So because I have a lot to cover today, I'm going to just kind of push through those. Those are really key in that. And as we're seeking to develop that obedience, there's some things that are just really important in parenting. One is consistency. Probably the hardest thing I know in the parenting process is to get off my rear and go and deal with whatever the behavior is. To have the same standard, to have training in mind, that we're always in the process of training, that is encouragement. It's interesting, as I've been teaching through this, my oldest son, Kent Jr., is living with us right now as has been transitioning, and just talking about parenthood and talking about the way that I parented him. And so that encouragement part, I'm real good at telling you what's wrong. I'm real good at seeing what's changed. I can see all kinds of the critical side of that, but I'm not as good at, I see the good things, but I don't talk about those. And so it's real easy to discourage because you're being critical and you see the little things that really don't matter. I was telling Debbie, in discipline with our kids, the big things I handled really well. It was the day-to-day little things that I had a harder time in dealing with that. Having discernment, just being able to discern, that is certainly a place where mom and dad together, Debbie can see things in relationship better than I do, and so I depend upon that and my willingness to listen to her and incorporate that. And then the other thing that it calls for is just a graciousness, and in that it means the attitude and the way that I go about doing it is that part. So we're going to transition today as we're seeking to train in that obedience. We want to take a look at clear biblical teaching on corrective discipline. And when we start talking about that, we're talking about spanking a child. And then culturally, there's a resistance to that, as you all well know. Matter of fact, there's a resistance to that for some good reasons. There's been a lot of child abuse. There's been, and so there's a reaction to that. They basically say to spank is abuse. The culture says that it's damaging to their psyche. It teaches a child to hit. There are much better methods than spanking, and so there's that cultural push that's there. And maybe even for some, as you start talking about discipline in this sense of spanking, parents might become concerned. maybe even agitated over the talk today. And so I know that could impact some. Some may have begun that process of spanking with their children and pulled back just because of their fear or concern of what has just not sure about what they should do. Some have a lot of doubts about spanking. Some, and I'll put myself in this category, have been abused as a child, that the spanking went too far, that there was abusiveness in that, and mine, I would say, is on the harsh side of that abusiveness, without having to describe that. And so, as a result of that, a parent can come out and say, "I'm never going to spank my child because I don't want to do that." And so, I understand that there are those that struggle with that as well. Some may just not be willing to spank because they're fearful of what the government's going to do. As I was doing some other research on this, it's amazing the articles of it. Should we obey the government when they finally say you cannot spank your child? Do you do it anyway? And that's already happening in other countries. And so some may say, this is crazy, this is foolish, get over it, spank your child in appropriate ways. And so there's just a wide range of attitudes and beliefs and views over that. What we want to do today is talk about what does God's Word say, and that must govern my choices and my decisions in that. We are certainly not advocating abuse. We're not advocating hate towards that child. We want to denounce the behavior that leads to abuse. And Scripture makes it really clear that you can spank and do it in a way that is very biblical and honoring to God, and also corrective and beneficial to the child. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about three notions real quick, and then I want to leave room for hopefully conversation if questions as we go through that. So I'm going to push through these things. So the first one is the nature of our children shows their need for the rod and for wisdom it imparts. And so the culture once again speaks to the idea that children do not that they're born ethically and morally good, or even neutral, and that if you just teach them, if you educate them, if you talk to them, that is sufficient, that spanking is not a necessary thing. But the problem that they see is just the lack of information, whereas Scripture makes it really clear that children are not born morally or ethically good or neutral. Jeremiah 17:9 says that the heart is desperately deceitful and wicked, and so the problem ultimately is for that child is that they're a sinner. They're born in sin. Ephesians 2:1-3 says that you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of our body and the mind. And we were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. Romans 5 there that you have in your notes just makes it really clear that everyone who is born in this world is born sinful, separated from God, and that is their condition. And so it calls then for this process here of, it's not just a matter of giving them the right information or talking them to death. I have heard Debbie on numerous occasions talk to moms, and it's like, you're talking to your child too much. It's time for some corrective action to take place there, and in that process. And so Proverbs 22:15 says that folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far from him. Here, when we're using the word folly, we're not talking about childishness, like spilling the milk or doing something that is typical of that child's age and stage, that they might make some childish stuff, run over mommy's toes with the tricycle, or take something. I did this several times. You take stuff apart, and I never get it back together again, and now it's ruined. I wasn't trying to be destructive. I was just curious about how things worked and would take those things apart. And so there's a difference there between folly and childishness or immaturity. And when we deal with immaturity, we deal with that through being patiently instructing, redirecting, helping them own that. When a child spills the milk in our house, we oops and we pull back, and try to capture as much of it as can, and then we let the child go get some towels and start helping clean up. So that's not a punitive thing. That's hey, you spilled your milk, we help clean up. We had a child who, when they would eat, and the floor would look like more food on the floor than on the table. Well, we let a dustpan and broom, and we let that child sweep that up every time they come to our house and help participate in that. And guess what? They get tired of doing that, and they learn that to be less messy in that process. But I'm not spanking the child or overly correcting them because they're just being a child. And then you just deal with, once again, ages, male, femaleness. There's a big difference in that kind of a thing. But folly or foolishness in Scripture has the idea that there's no fear of God. And if you go back to those passages we referred to earlier, there's nothing in them that would give them a fear of God at that stage in their lives. They are not submissive to authority. They live for the immediacy of their own lusts, their own cravings, their expectations, their hopes and fears. They're living out of that mode. And so their sense here of a child that is living in folly is that they are rejecting God and they're rejecting your authority. It's ultimately an authority issue. And a child who goes unchecked in those areas, ultimately that leads to destructive thinking and behavior. So when we allow a child to go unchecked, when it is an issue of authority, when it's an issue of folly, those children will resist correction. They will resist authority. They will want their way, and children are fiercely self-centered. And so that is key. Sorry, I'm going to need some water, Debbie, if you can help me out there. Thank you. It's that summertime, yummy. So when we're looking at that, we're really looking at a child that is choosing to disobey, and that is in their nature as we look at that. And I look at, and I end up dealing with children later in life and parents later in life, and you wonder why they're so out of control here. Well, it's a lot because they didn't control and manage and train when they were younger. And so when you get a teenager in an adult-sized body, they don't submit to anyone. There's no rule or authority that they want to bring themselves under. And then we have the problems we have. The second notion that I want to look at is the rod is a key tool for driving out foolishness. So this heart and attitude of rebellion is that God has ordained the rod of discipline for this condition. And so they are refusing, thank you, they're refusing to be under authority. So the parent, I keep saying this over and over again, I just realized it's in my notes several times. It must be an important issue, is that the parent who refuses to bring their child under that authority, there will be much trouble for them. Proverbs 29:15 says that the rod of reproof, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but the child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Proverbs 23:13 through 14 says, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with the rod, he will not die. I remember the first time I read that, and just quickly just saying, having come from a family where there was physical abuse, I guess I'll just leave it at that so that I don't have to cause anybody angst. I never died from the physical abuse, okay? There were scars from that. The stronger abuse was the constant critical attack that impacted me. But when I read that, he will not die, I just love that wisdom. If you discipline your child, they will not die. And so that is a huge picture there. But it goes on, he says, if you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from death. And here there's a sense of spiritual death because they're not learning to be under your authority. I said over and over again with our kids growing up, if you don't learn to obey me, you're going to have a very hard time obeying God. And I appreciate the focus here in this material is that it's an issue of obeying God, thus they obey me. So as we're talking about the heart, we're ultimately going after the heart there. But knowing that faithful, timely, controlled use of corrective discipline is a God-ordained tool for rescue. And so it's what God has given us in that process. Context matters. And so as we're looking at this, this is not, we're not talking about a parent who's angry or fed up, have come to the end of themselves in that moment. They've had a hard day at work, and now I'm displaying my wrath on the child. And that's ultimately where abuse comes, is that now I'm taking out my frustration. How dare you disrupt me? How dare you cause me trouble? And you're going to feel every bit of that wrath from me. And so the context of this is not that. That is abuse. When a parent is taking revenge or wrath on a child because they're frustrated, because they're tired, because they're ready to give up. The issue here is the need for the child to be rescued from death, meaning the spiritual death, and the result of rebellion that happens in an unchanged heart that is ultimately down the road. I think as I think of parenting, there's so many different stages and different things that have to take place as you're dealing with a child. And so when you go from a 1-year-old child all the way up to an 18-year-old child, the way I deal with that child is significantly different at each one of those stages. And so it's important that I understand where I'm at in that process of dealing with a child. Going down as well as just this is not a child that is acting foolish. This is a child who is rejecting God's direction in his life. So the rod of correction brings wisdom to the child by first providing immediate tactical demonstration of the foolishness of their rebellion, and then secondly imparting the child the proper fear of punishment. And once again, they're saying the proper fear. It's hard since I live here in Texarkana. I was the principal at Trinity Christian School for 3 years, and we practiced corporal punishment. And so I got to administer corporal punishment. Licks is what they call it, for 3 years at the Christian school. And I just want you to know, I know this is being recorded, I absolutely despise doing it because the goal of it was to scare them scare them into behaving. There was not going after the heart of that behavior. And then to spank somebody else's child is just the heart. I mean, I never ever want to have to do it again. It was just a very difficult thing, but it was a part of what I accepted as the principle there. There is a sense of fear. I think of my child, and you guys might think I'm a horrible dad, who kept trying to reach up onto the stove. And you would say, no, it's going to burn you. No, it's hot. Don't touch it up there. No, no, no. And you keep no, no, and no until at some point that I finally let them feel a little bit of that heat. Guess what? They quit trying to touch up there. Now, I didn't let them burn themselves to, but I allow them to do that. We allowed our kids to have, our boys to have pocket knives and at an early age, and people would freak out and go, I can't believe a kid has a knife. Well, we trained them and taught them, and yes, they might cut themselves, but they're not going to die. It was kind of one of those things. And so when they cut themselves, they learn. It's like, ooh, that hurts. I don't want to do that again. Those kind of things. So there is a place that God actually gave us the sense of pain for a reason. It teaches us. If you jump off a 10-foot deal and you break your leg or whatever, you realize, especially for guys, I can't do that and survive. There's a pain thing that's there, and God built that in for us as parents. I love Hebrews 12:11. It says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Get the word? Painful. There's pain involved in this. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. And so there's a sense that as you're going through life with your child and there's a point where the rod is applied, there's pain, that produces a harvest of righteousness and peace as they are trained by that. And so and it's hard because remembering my children are a little bit harder than we currently have 11 grandchildren, and so I see grandchildren and deal with grandchildren all the time. But I can watch a grandchild who's pushing the boundaries and rebelling and struggling, and when finally a parent steps in, whatever that 1, 2, 3, or 10 or 20, whatever you get to, and they remove them from the room. There's a spanking. They come back. The whole disposition has changed with a quick correction, and so done right. And so when they're trained by that, there's a process of growth that it becomes a greater peace that you experience in the household. So the third thing we want to look at is, what is the rod? And let me just read this to you. It says the rod is a parent in faith toward God and faithfulness toward his or her children, undertaking the responsibility of careful, timely, measured, and controlled use of physical punishment to underscore the importance of obeying God, thus rescuing the child from continuing in his foolishness until death. Let's go through that definition just real quick. It's a parent exercising it in the sense that I'm not looking towards anybody other adult exercising that level of punishment with my child. So the context is in a parent-child relationship. It's an act of faith. Here saying that I'm willing to believe God's word and trust God's word and his way in that. And so as a parent, I'm obeying what God says and seeking that is going to accomplish what he said it will accomplish when done well. And then it's an act of faithfulness. It's an expression of love. Scripture actually says that the parent who will not discipline their child does not love them. There's a love. If I don't do them, it says that I really do not care about them ultimately. It's a responsibility. It's not a parent determining to punish. It's a parent determining to obey. And when I think of it in that way, of the sense that I'm choosing to obey God's process and God's way in this method, that it is a responsibility. And then it's a measured use of that. The rod is a careful, timely, measured, and controlled use of physical punishment. It's never a point of venting. And then there's a sense of rescuing. He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. So let's move towards kind of some practical here. We have a little bit of time, so hoping I could get there. It's just as when do we apply the rod? And so the when is when you have given a directive that the child has heard and understood and is within his capacity to obey. I did take issue that they're always he. We're using the he. It's a he, she. So the boys seem to get paddled more than the girls. They get in trouble more. But anyway, in his capacity to obey, and he has not obeyed without challenge, without excuse, without delay, and then the rod is in play. And so, once again, the key here is that is without challenge, without fussiness or complaining, that there's an immediate act and movement forward in that. So kind of what that would look like, and we'll give here's what it can look like, and then there's lots of variations in this. But if you are a parent who is in that early stages, this is really good for you to look through. Those that might be in later stages, I'll give you some things in that. And then if you're done, it's kind of helpful to come back and look at that. But the first one is how do we exercise this? The first one is to take the child to a place where you can speak together in privacy. The goal is not to humiliate the child, but to isolate the child and discuss and work through that, talking about the audience and the environment in that. I can already hear parents saying, I would never do anything else. We had 3 boys in diapers at one time. So you talk about a busy, crazy house. But that environment, that audience, is really important in that process. The second one is to tell him specifically what he has done or failed to do. Never spanking for general purposes. I can't tell you how many times I got spanked, and my dad would say, "You're getting it for everything I've missed." I was like, "What does that mean?" And I got it, for everything I did. In the sense here that I'm not asking the child what you did. So I'll just tell on one of my grandchildren. Earlier this week, I was over at Stephen's house, and Aiden who's 6, decided to kind of put spit slobber, lots of it, on my arm. And so first of all, I don't like that at all. I don't share cups, but I just said, Aiden, that's not appropriate. Don't spit on me. I don't want he wasn't spitting at me. He was just spitting on me. And I said, don't do that. Wiped it off, dried it off, and he literally rotated in my lap and started to do it to my other arm. Okay, so at that point, I said, I told you not to do that. You can't sit in my lap. Get down. Now, Dad was across the room, so we didn't move to the spank part of that. And then as he's sitting there kind of sulking because he doesn't get to sit in my lap and hang out with me right there in the immediacy, he's over there sulking. So I let him sulk for a little while. And then I said, hey, Aiden, come back over here. And I said, Aiden, why did I tell you you had to get on my lap? Mistake. Because he said, I don't know. Right? What he needed was, I told you not to slobber on me, spit on me, don't do that. That's why you had to get off my lap. We're good, let's move forward. So there's that sense of don't ask, just tell. You know what they did. They disobeyed you, and so you're dealing with that. There's no debate about it. And then you secure their acknowledgement of what they've done. And then the fourth one there is to remind the child that you're not angry, but that you must obey God. And I think that's one of the key struggles is in the midst of it, for me, was that I would become frustrated by their behavior, and I would take it personal. Like, you're doing that I do that if you drive crazy around me too. If pull out in front of me and say, you did that on purpose. Debbie's like, they don't even know you're there. And then, catch up and somebody who's totally clueless that you were even there. But the sense that we take it so personally when our kids rebel, when they act like they are. Their hearts are far from God, and they don't have that God conscious in them, in the sense to be able to do that. And so we take that very personally. So remind them that you're not angry, and that you must obey God. And so you tell them how many swats they're going to get. And then 6 is lay the child across your lap. So that should give you some clue of kind of the age we're talking about here. So if the child is big enough that it's kind of tough to lay across their lap, oftentimes it might be that the child needs to just reach for his ankles or lean on a chair. So age is important here. Part of that is less fight. The less fight, the less other unintended harm that might come. Administer the swats. Take the child onto your lap. And let them know how much you love them. As appropriate, share the gospel with them. And then check to see that there's a sense of restoration. So if I discipline my child and they're resistant to me, there's a good chance I might have done something, handled that in a way that needs to be resolved in the moment of that. And then as time allows for, to be able to pray with them in that. So as I read that scenario, my first reaction is, I'd never get anything done. Anybody else? It's like, man, with 3 boys in diapers, we would be spending forever in the bedroom disciplining. Actually, Debbie would be, because I was always at work. So a couple of thoughts, questions that might come to mind. One is, when is a child old enough? And there's no set at this age. But when they start walking and moving, when they're going for the electrical outlet and you say no, it's amazing. They'll turn and look at you. Who's going to win? We all have done it, right? You have the homes where you childproof and you put everything up so you don't have to say no, and then you have the homes where parents have everything down and the kids learn what they can touch and what they can't touch, and it's amazing how they do that. And so it's just a matter of where you're at in that. But when there's a clear, willful disobedience, and you can tell that in their behavior. So another grandchild illustration. We have a little over a 1-year-old who at her home gets to walk around with a sippy cup and drink because it's all tile. In my house we have carpet, so you can't leave the kitchen with your sippy cup. Stay in there. Don't cross into the carpet. It's a battle every time. She's going to try to walk right across that carpet, and she'll stand there at the edge doing this, and then she'll put her big hairy toe across the line and wait and see, depending on who's in the room, if it's me or Debbie or her mom, who's going to say, no, keep the cup in the kitchen. So they know. They may not be able to articulate, but they know. And so there may be appropriate times for a flick, for a pat on the bottom, a squeeze of a hand. There might be at that younger age. Next question is, when is a child too old? And here they recommend when they're double digits, 10 is probably when they might be too old for you to be spanking them. I can say that if you're spanking them into their teen years, you're not in control, and that's probably not healthy if you're at that stage with a child. But probably, if you've been doing this and consistently doing this, then there's a sense that really as they get older, less and less would you have to have the need for that. And then I'll just say for those with older children, once you get past that stage, there's still a need for adjustment, for punishment that would come, for discipline. And so what we've done with that is a couple of different things. One is natural consequences. You break it. Sorry, you broke it. Now you don't get it. I don't run out and replace it for them. Just allowing the natural consequences and using that as an opportunity to teach what's happening there. Another one would be logical consequences. A logical consequence is you stole the candy bar as we were heading out. We're going to go back in and give them back the candy bar, and you're going to apologize for doing that. That's a natural consequence for the child. I remember we had a babysitter that was the same gal that babysat for us a lot. And so when the kids would disobey, and she would tell us, Stephanie would say, yeah, Andrew didn't obey tonight. Then we were immediately getting on the phone, and they were having to talk to Miss Stephanie and apologize for misbehaving immediately in that process. And so there's some of those logical consequences that follow. You don't want to eat the green peas that we have at the table, or whatever it is. They don't want to eat it for whatever reason. They don't want to eat it. Once again, I have to think of what all is going on there. But if we say that's all you get for the rest of the night, either eat it or you're done, then we're done. They will not starve to death. Okay? But if I say that's all you get, nothing else the rest of the night, and then an hour later I'm giving them a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they won. You're not teaching them obedience. You're teaching them that I just have to wait long enough and I'll get what I want. And so whatever that logical consequence is that comes as a result of that, we had she was a teenager, daughter, and she was slamming her door when she didn't like whatever decision was made. And I said, your door is a privilege. If you slam it again, I'll take it off the hinges. Slammed the door again. I immediately took it off the hinges and put it away. And, then ensued, you're like, where am I going to change? And it's like, well, you can change in the bathroom, and the door is a privilege. It's not a right. Guess what? She never slammed her door again after that. Another would be just a loss of privilege, just different things that you might seek to employ that hurts. There's got to be a loss involved in that. For one of my children, if I sent him to his room, that was like the greatest thing that could happen, because he loved reading and he would just loved to be alone. That worked great. Send my other youngest son into the bedroom, that's the worst thing in the world that could happen to him. He couldn't stand to be alone. So you have to know your child as they get older and you've moved past the spanking stage. Another question that might be asked, I'm going to run out of time, is can I use timeout instead of spanking? And the suggestion is that basically don't substitute timeout for spanking. First, it's God ordained, and second, it seems to prolong the problem. So they'll stand in the corner, they'll have their timeout and stew, and it seems to increase the problem. A properly applied spanking brings resolution much quicker in the process. What if my child says, I didn't hear you? Part of that process is training them to hear your voice. Over all the other voices, believe it or not, children can learn that your voice, and they know that it's you speaking to them. And when you give into that, you're allowing them to play the game with you and see who's going to win I just didn't hear you. So That's fine. You'll learn to listen to my voice, and we begin that process. Um, Another question that was raised here: if I follow your counsel, all I'll do is spank. That's all I'll be doing. And the truth is that when we discipline, it produces a fruit of righteousness and peace as we do that. And so, yeah, it may be really busy at first if you've never been doing it, but if you do that consistently, there'll be greater peace, greater obedience in the process. And I can't do it, but Debbie could give you thousands of illustrations of seeing how that has changed when she has helped other ladies, gals, dealing with their children. Another one is, what if I'm mad? When you're mad, that's when you're going to blow across the boundaries. And so there's a sense that you need a timeout before you deal with the discipline that may need to be handed down and get control of yourself. Once again, typically we get mad because we're taking it personal. It's not personal. And the other is that it's inconvenient, so you're inconveniencing me, and so we don't want to deal with that. Another question is, what if I'm not at home? Depending on the age of the child, that can be something that's said when you get home, this is going to happen, and you immediately take care of it when you get home. In our current climate, spanking a child in public is probably not a wise thing to do, but I would look for other place to do that than in a public environment. But I wouldn't let that be a cause for their ability to disobey and rebel, even though you're in public. And then I'm trying to get out the door to a doctor's appointment or get to church. My child disobeys. Do I discipline and show up late? And then once again, it's one of those where you have to look at the situation and the age of the child and determine what I need to do in that. I would rather you, Jared's back here, I'd rather you be late to church. Wait, some of you guys already are late to church, right? I'd rather you be late to church as you're in the process of training your child than to be there on time. If it's to a doctor's appointment, most of the doctors will let you still work your way back in if you're late in that process. It kind of just depends on the stage that you're in that process. Are there other questions? I feel like I've just zoomed through that as quick as I can. So, questions, concerns? Yes. I hit him again. No, just joking. What was that? Did I get an amen? What I don't do is what was done to me is I'll give you something to cry about, and then my dad would really well into you. There are children who, and you have to be really careful, so I'm trying to think of how to answer that question, is that there are some children that are really sensitive, and so it may just take, you just barely touch their bottom with a diaper on, and it's like the end of the world has come. And then and then you have the child who you spank and they're just, it's just gritting their teeth. My suggestion, I'll look for anybody else who wants to add into that, would be that you don't stop disciplining him because of that, but that you might give him some time out and then come back and explain what you're doing. Then I would just check, what is my methodology? Am I doing that in front of somebody? Am I doing it out of anger? Am I just doing it real quick and getting it over with? Kind of what's happening there, and then come back and talk about the need for obedience in that process. Then I would employ my spouse into that as well. Is that both of you are saying the same, messaging the same. This is what we expect. Yeah.
I think that can also be a good way of manipulating too. Because I'm gonna act like this with discipline because you're not gonna want to spank me anymore. They might not even be conscious of that thought, but just like you said, just do it anyway, and it's your choice to be angry, but it's responsibility to spank you when you disobey.
That's good.
And obviously, if a kid's not saved, they don't have the Holy Spirit in them to give them.
Yeah. Did you guys all hear that? I don't know. Basically, she was saying that it may be a method that the child is using to to manipulate. So the overdramatic child is trying to manipulate, and the child who gets really angry and harsh and hard might be trying to manipulate in that. So she's basically saying, you still do it, you still explain why that's important. That sullen hardness is part of the willful disobedience. That's a hard issue still. When I got in trouble, I'd be mad forever, whether it was school or not, because it was how dare you tell me what to do or control me or do whatever happened to me as a result of that. Same happened if somebody my brother hit me. It was the same kind of reaction. It's still a hard issue, ultimately under that. So I would just keep doing it and addressing that hard issue as they go through it. Willingness to be disciplined, because ultimately God's going to do that.
We didn't have that for very long, but we had that with one of ours for a short period. And like you say, it was a hard issue. And Wendy handled it really well. She just fought it with extra calmness and extra love. It's like, I know this is your heart, but you're going to have to calm down. And just dealt with the hard issue later on a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because your reaction is, you spank them, they go Your reaction is to go That was my reaction.
Yeah.
And Wendy she went the opposite way. She went really calm. And that
Yeah. My youngest son would still tell you to this day, actually, I just heard it within the last couple of months, is that spanking did not work. Well, okay. So God used something else later in his life. I don't know what it was, but anyway. Yes. Very good. Did everybody hear that? I don't know if I can repeat it as well. Can you say it just a little louder? It's good. Alienation versus restoration. I like that. Hmm. Yeah. 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 It's good. And that will certainly come later too, as they get older, when they're starting to reason and think through those, is that what you say, it needs to be what you're going to do, and not changing my mind. So when you're handing down discipline beyond spanking when they're older, and you say, well, you're grounded for 3 months, really? Are you going to really ground them for 3 months, and are you going to keep massaging that and changing that? Make it hurt, make it short, make it doable, so that you did what you said you're going to do. If you said you're not getting anything else to eat, don't give them something else to eat. I mean, it's just whatever it is you've decided. But is that reasonable? And I think for those that have mom and dad in the home, you've got to be talking to each other about what's reasonable and what's not, because what I think is reasonable isn't necessarily reasonable when Debbie looks at it. And so I oftentimes have to adjust and say, okay, I'm going to go with what she says. And there's times in dealing with boys when they got older that Debbie had to look at me and say, I don't really like the way you're doing that. I'm a little concerned, but I'm going to trust you because you're a male and you're dealing with males. And so when I go from don't talk to your mother that way to don't talk to my wife that way, there's something else about to happen. I mean, there's no man in here that can talk to my wife. There's a certain way, and I'm gonna bow up real quick. And so when you have a teenager who goes from don't talk to your mom that way to no man talks to my wife that way, it's a serious business. And so you don't want to get there, but I've been there with one of my children. So, other questions, thoughts, input? Yeah. Yeah, I would respond to, first of all, age again, that space there of how old they are. A timeout for a 3-year-old for punishment isn't going to really do any good. A timeout where you see that child starting to get emotional and we're moving the wrong direction, we might want to give them that break. As they get older, a timeout might work. It's the ability of the child to reason and think. Go in the corner and think about what you did. They already passed that. So you walked across the carpet with juice, and we're going to tell you to go time out. It's not going to work. The SWAT, or okay, you don't get your water, and we put it up too high, and she can't get it, and she's not getting it until dinner time or whatever time we do that. There's got to be an immediacy to that. So I don't think timeout's necessarily wrong, but it's more of a calming, slow down a behavior that's heading in a direction. But when they've willfully disobeyed, the SWAT is the quickest way to move towards resolution. And I liked what Stephanie said, just that reconciliation in that. Any other questions? I'm going to end with this as the kids are coming in, and so I'm just going to tell you from my own heart. If you are one, male or female, who struggles with anger, and you go from 5 to 10 like that, you're the one who needs some help, okay? Because I was one of those. I moved from discipline to abuse really quick, and so I needed help, and by God's grace, He orchestrated that help for me, so that my anger level went from 5 to a 1, and that's where I lived instead of from a 5 to a 10. And so if you're the one that struggles with that, I encourage you to humble yourself and get help, because there is something driving that anger, and that's resolvable. So I just encourage you in that, okay? All right. Thanks, guys.
say